Evening and welcome to the 14th webinar of Season 11 of the National Humanities Center's Humanities in Class webinar series. I'm Mike Williams, Vice President for Education Programs, and I'm so very happy, so very honored to be here with you all tonight. As always, I enjoy these times when we can all come together. There are roughly about 1,800 of you all registered for tonight's webinar. So thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us for this webinar this evening. We're so very excited to have Gregory Downs, who's here tonight for our session, which is entitled Nat Turner, Black Prophet. Again, our leader, Gregory P. Downs, Professor of History at the University of California, Davis. I'll begin by giving you a little background about the National Humanities Center. As you all very well know, we are located in Durham, North Carolina, and for 48 years, soon to be 50, we have supported the best in humanities scholarship and humanities education. We are, in fact, the only private nonprofit institution devoted exclusively to the study of the humanities. Here at the center, our education programs team serves as a nexus between our scholars, our speakers, our humanities experts, and you all, our educators, day in and day out. Early mornings and late nights, our goal is to build bridges between that scholarly world and your everyday working classroom. You all are, in fact, educators at all levels. Large majority are at the K-12 level. But we have collegiate, graduate level educators as well. We have informal educators. We have leaders of historical sites. We have media specialists who are all joining us for our webinar series, and many of our other offerings, joined by an outstanding team who are very passionate about this work and who are committed to ensuring that our programming meets your needs. I want to take a few moments to update you on a few of our recent events here at the center. If you will, please check us out at nationalhumanitycenter.org for this month's features and so much more that's happening at the center. In panel 1, from left to right, featured research, connecting research and learning across disciplines. This is our 2026 Humanities in STEM Faculty Institute, which will be held at the historic campus of Howard University, August 3rd through 7th. Collaboration between the humanities and STEM is crucial in fostering innovation, encouraging critical thinking, and developing a more nuanced understanding of our world. From healthcare to environmental science, technology to literature, synergies among these fields are leading to pioneering new discoveries and shaping a more sustainable future. This year's institute is open to university faculty, and registration is currently open in our education programs, professional development section of the NHC's website. In the center panel, you'll find our featured research between the medium and the message, examining how media technologies reflect distinctive identities, preserve cultural elements, and help foster community. Our featured fellows include Alejandra Bronfman, CJ Jones, and Young Kun Oh. Again, if you get an opportunity, please navigate to that page and check out this month's features. 2026 Being Human Festival, in partnership with the Humanists and Humanities organization across the country. The NHC will stage Being Human from April 18th to May 2nd. Featuring a range of public humanities events, this initiative will support the development of programming for diverse, non-academic audiences across geographic regions and subject areas. Next up, we are accepting applications. We will be accepting applications for the next few weeks. I guess I should say March is right around the corner. But I'm super excited to inform you all about the Teaching the Digital Diaspora, which will be hosted on the historic campus of Prairie View A&M University, which is just west of Houston, Texas. I will be joined by a select group of passionate interdisciplinary educators from all over the country from June 15th and June 20th. If you are interested in participating in this year's Teaching African American Studies Institute, I encourage you to apply. We will accept applications until March 30th, 2026. So if you are interested, come on out and check us out. This series began at the National Humanities Centers for the first 3 summers. We hosted it at the NHC. Last year, we moved to the campus of Prairie View A&M University, and we will be there again this summer. So if you're interested, definitely check us out. All of this important and necessary work I'm describing is informed by a strong and talented teacher advisory council. These are teachers all across the country who give us feedback and who consult with us on various projects. This year's council includes teachers and educators who have experience with various areas of our programming, including webinar attendees, online courses, and former Institute participants as well. I see 2 of them who are in the chat tonight, actually more than 2, but ITAs for this evening. Dorcas, I see your message about TASI. Yes, we had a phenomenal time. Dorcas participated in it, and now she's on the Teacher Advisory Council. If you or your colleagues are interested in checking out any of the past recordings, please navigate to our webinars landing page and follow the webinars archives link to our dedicated YouTube page, where you will find our past recordings. As always, please know that you have to be present to receive those precious CEU credits. So watching the on-demand video, you will not receive the CEU credits if you merely watch the recordings. As a matter of housekeeping, I should let you all know that tonight's webinar is audio and PowerPoint based. So you will not see our speaker directly. Again, this is entirely audio. You will see the presentation slides. You will hear both of our voices. But you will be able to interact with us through the chat box. So there are 2 primary chat boxes. One is the audience chat box, where you can interact among each other, and the other is the speaker Q&A box. So if you have any questions for Dr. Downs this evening, drop them in the Q&A chat, and I will bring them to his attention at the appropriate time. Thank you for joining us. You are attending the webinar entitled Nat Turner, Black Prophet. A leader for this session is Gregory P. Downs, Professor of History, University of California, Davis. We also have Dorcas Gyekye and Keisha Rembert, who are members of our NHC Teacher Advisory Council. They will serve as our TAs for tonight's session. They will be active in the chat. They're already very active in the chat, sharing their thoughts, resources, and asking questions. Thank you both for being here this evening. Professor Gregory P. Downs studies the political and cultural history of the United States in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Particularly, he investigates the transformative impact of the Civil War, the end of slavery, and the role of military force in establishing new meanings of freedom. He is the author of 2 monographs and 1 book of essays on Reconstruction, and mapping occupation. An interactive digital history of the U.S. Army's occupation of the South. You can find that at www.mappingoccupation.org. He is also a co-editor of a scholarly volume on the post-Civil War world. He is also co-author with the late Anthony Kay of a scholarly biography, which you all will be hearing about tonight, of the enslaved rebel Nat Turner. I should also note that Dr. Anthony Kay was a former NHC fellow, 2015-16, and former vice president of scholarly programs at the National Humanities Center. As a public historian, Downs co-wrote the National Park Service's theme study on Reconstruction and helped edit the Park Service's handbook on Reconstruction. His efforts have been highlighted in The Atlantic and the New York Times. Downs is increasingly interested in the relationship between the U.S. Civil War and concurrent crises in Central America and Spain. His article, The Mexicanization of American Politics, the United States, Transnational Path from Civil War to Stabilization, appeared in the American Historical Review in 2012. In 2016, Downs delivered the Burroughs Lectures at Penn State University's Richards Civil War Era Center on the U.S. Civil War as part of an international revolutionary wave that ran from Spain and Cuba in the 1850s through the U.S. and Mexico in the late 1860s, and back to Spain and Cuba in the late 1860s and 70s. Those lectures formed the basis of his most recent book. In 2018, he was elected to the Society of American Historians and given UC Davis's Distinguished Scholarly Public Service Award. He is also the author of a prize-winning collection of short stories. To all of our teachers who are here tonight, you are filling the room. I see you all here. I see your comments in the chat. I look forward to this talk this evening. And Dr. Downs, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to hearing from you.
All right. Thank you so much for having me, and I really appreciate all your work to help set this up, Mr. Williams, and that lovely introduction. I'm assuming it appears on my end like my voice is going out, though. Knowing teachers, I am sure that if it is not, I'll be hearing from you very soon. I am really, always touched to talk about this project and about history. But I'm especially touched to speak in this context, to be introduced by a multiple award-winning educator, Mr. Williams, and to get to speak to so many dedicated educators in the room, who are really the people who almost everyone in this country learns history from, much more so than college professors or writers or people, on television documentaries or any of those other things, as well as the many other ways that you touch people's lives. And I was, many years ago, a 9th and 10th grade teacher, social studies and English. So I have some glimmer into how hard your work is, and I don't take lightly your time this late in the afternoon, and I hope I'll use it well. And I really look forward to your questions. I built in some moments along the way, 3 to 4 different pause places, in case there are questions that have built up, and I think Mr. Williams will help alert me to those. So I'm here to talk about probably the most famous enslaved rebel in U.S. history, a man named Nat, who had been owned by the white Turner family, and whose name is reproduced by history as Nat Turner, though it's not clear, as I'll discuss, that this is ever a name he himself used or would have chosen to use if the rebellion had succeeded and he had been naming himself. I'm going to talk about this in the context of the book I co-wrote with my deceased friend, Anthony Kay, who had taken the book up while he was first a professor, worked on it while he was a fellow at NHC, continued working on it while he was vice president there. He loved it there, and contracted esophageal cancer, and asked me to be prepared to take it up. I'll talk a little bit about that context. He died in 2017. I do believe that while this is a challenging topic, that there are many ways in which it can be incorporated into different classroom lessons, depending on how you're structuring your classroom, your specific curricular needs. And there's lots of sort of fascinating things, including lots of interesting primary source documents that are pretty widely available. And I've tried to include some of those in the resources, and I'm glad to provide more. And rather than presume that I can make the connection after 25 years away from the junior high school and high school classroom, that I can make the connection between the book and classroom type implementation, I thought I'd be better off telling you about the history and then responding to questions and comments that reflect your sense of how it might be useful or challenging for you. Because I do remember being in different professional developments a long time ago as a teacher and hearing people say, this is how you should do it, and thinking, well, I don't know if they've ever been in my classroom or if this is how it works. So I'm really hopeful that you'll be helpful in guiding me and all of us toward those steps of application. Before I go into the story, I want to take a moment to name the unusual way this book came to be. It's an extremely unusual collaboration, and I want to make sure that I acknowledge that collaboration and the book's ultimate author. quite a number of years ago, more than 9 years ago. My friend Tony Kaye, pictured here, began work, well, no, this is when he began, more closer to 18 to 20 years ago, began work on a book about Nat. At the time, he was a professor of history at Penn State University, an associate editor of our field's leading scholarly journal, and the author of an extraordinary first book on the way enslaved people understood their immediate world, especially their concept of their neighborhoods, how it shaped the way they used proximity to judge allies and enemies, and why the dense but also delimited worlds of plantations were challenging sites to build large-scale rebellions, even though they were also sites where very local, deep, intimate communities could be formed. As Tony finished that book, he wanted to test his ideas about the challenges of understanding the rural neighborhoods of the South, and especially of enslaved people in the South, against the best-known rebellion in U.S. history, and to examine it in as many ways as he could so that he could understand how to read these people's geographic understanding of the world, shaped by what it meant to live not in a city or in a car-driven suburb, but in deeply rural areas where they're deeply focused on things like paths and trails, cut-throughs through the woods, cut-throughs through swamps, as they talk about how to get from one place to another. And he said, a few years into his project, he said, I started out thinking this would be a quick, small book, but the more I learned, the longer it got. I wanted to really understand this from Turner's point of view. And he said, it's taken me a long time, and I really had to dig deep. He was working on this book when he was diagnosed with esophageal cancer. And at that point, he called me and asked me to be prepared to step in if he did not live to see its completion. From 2016 to 17, we met to discuss the book, talked on the phone, exchanged emails, and made plans we both hoped would never need to be fulfilled. Tony passed away on May 14th, 2017. Only days before his passing, he asked his wife, Melissa, who also remains a friend of the center and was there last year, to send the remainder of the materials that he had collected, first electronically and then in boxes, as he at last reckoned with the fact he would not be able to complete the book or even the chapters he had hoped to finish before sending to me. And I received from him thousands of pages of chapters, chapter outlines, notes to himself, notes to me, primary source documents, and other materials. And I also carried with me the way that his voice and his vision had changed as he worked and tried to understand more and more about this important, but ultimately challenging person to pin down and to understand. Tony wrote that to understand Nat, he had to rethink his understanding of early American religion. To understand Nat, quote, did what he did because he believed it is what God wanted him to do. And it took Nat 9 years to finally accept the commands he said that he received, quote, from the Spirit who spoke to the prophets in former times. At first, he was misunderstood by other enslaved people who thought he was telling them to obey their white masters. But I'm quoting Tony again. He is saying, I have to obey God. And over his time, especially at NHC, Tony turned from this geographical approach to an understanding of the ways Nat talked and thought about religion. And he left me a mass of materials on Nat's religious beliefs, his interest in warfare, his generalship, the remembered history of rebellions involving other Black evangelicals in the region, where Black Methodists had fought for the British in both the Revolutionary War and in the War of 1812, and where some Black Methodists from the region had gone to Sierra Leone and led a rebellion there against a British governor. And over 6 years, I worked to pull those threads together into this book. And it's his vision executed through words I wrote, aiming to fulfill a vision he had to the degree that I can understand it. And it was also a labor of love, a testament to a friend and a way of convincing myself I was communing with that friend even after he had left this world. I'm glad to discuss that unusual collaboration with anybody who wants to. But now I will move to the story of the book. Now, you will see some images here and elsewhere of Nat Turner. And I need to say first that none of those are contemporary or reliable. Some are from the time period, but are purely imaginative. And all we have are some brief written sketches of his appearance in newspaper accounts. And many of those don't actually add up, even on basic things like, his size, much less, other distinctive aspects with him. So every image you'll see of him, whether from the 1830s or the 2000s, is at some level a projection. And some of those are by people deeply sympathetic to him, some by people who are fascinated but not always sympathetic, and some by people who are horrified by him. But regardless of their sympathy, none of them is reliably his image. And this is something I work with students and suggest to teachers all the time. It is a interesting and in some ways helpful, but in some ways unhelpful aspect of our world that if you type in image Nat Turner, you're going to get a lot. Including, with AI, you will start getting images of other people that it is desperately trying to convince you is Nat Turner. And all of these are interesting for what they're trying to convey. And yet we do need to remember that none of these are by people who ever saw him. Nor, for that matter, can we be confident of his name, as I mentioned. He came down to us as Nat Turner. But that name was given to him primarily by white speakers, not by his collaborators among the enslaved community. And it is not at all clear that he ever wanted to be called that. It is possible that had he lived, he might have selected that. But there were also people who thought he was called Nat Travis, after the enslaver who controlled him in the latter part of his life. And many enslaved people referred to him as Nat, although they would take care to find other ways to distinguish him from a different Nat. On the other hand, I will say that there are a number of Turners, black Turners, in the area in 1830 and throughout the early 1800s as he's growing up. Many of these, as I'll tell you, are the descendants of freed people who were emancipated by relatives of his masters. And so it may well be that in that path they're choosing Turner. He might have chosen Turner as that name for that reason, but it is important to know that it is a name that is primarily brought down from the 1830s by white speakers, and often by the people condemning him to death. Now, interestingly, abolitionists and black speakers soon picked up the name as a way of giving him homage and respect worthy of a last name. And I respect that usage and way of using it, even if, as I acknowledge as a historian, we don't know that that's actually the last name he would want. So we live with a sense of trying to respect him and also trying to respect what we don't know about what he wanted. You can see some of these images of Nat here as the muscular warrior in the upper left, as a person surrendering from a position of strength, as an inspired prophet in a study by the great artist Charles White, the great 20th century artist Charles White, and as the leader of a small band of people in the image in the bottom left. And all capture aspects of what we know about him, but none capture a man in full, in part because he's such a complex person, it's not possible for one image, or in some ways, even one book to capture. But I'll try and give you first some of the basic facts about why he comes down to us, and then try and talk to you about why he's so interesting. On the afternoon of August 21st, 1831, a Sunday, Nat gathered a small group of collaborators together at a pond near the plantations where they lived. For months, Nat had been telling a group of them, about 4 people, about the visions the Holy Spirit had shown him, he said. Visions that suggested the time was right to attack the system they all hated, that suggested that if they attacked slavery, God would be on their side. Earlier, he had led them to make plans, then chosen to delay. But now, an eclipse, and then a remarkable set of colors in the sky caused by atmospheric phenomena that read as red in some places, blue in others, seemed to him a signal that it was at last time to act. on a charge that he had been hearing, though often incompletely, for 9 years. 4 collaborators brought 2 other men with them, and Nat quizzed them to be sure that they too were committed. Together they ate. On Sunday late afternoon, the other men drank, though Nat did not, and never did to our knowledge. And they waited for the fall of night and the end of the Sabbath. Just after midnight, very early Monday morning, they attacked 2 houses that belonged to the families that had controlled Nat, houses of a brother and sister, killing everyone there, taking weapons and food, and recruiting enslaved people to join them, and forcing some reluctant ones to join. And then they began to march onward across the rural neighborhood of Cross Keys, Virginia, on the southern edge of Southampton County, bordering the North Carolina state line. Over the course of 2 days, Nat and that small band grew from a handful of people to more than 40, perhaps more than that, marched from house to house of white people who had enslaved people, though sometimes marching past the houses of white people who did not, and attacking the people inside, the white people inside, men, women, and children, and urging and at times forcing enslaved people to join their band. As they marched, they pursued complex military maneuvers, dividing and recombining, launching probing attacks, then rushing in, practicing both ambush and frontal assault. In their plan to clear the area of white people who enslaved human beings, and to reach the county seat, which this seems impossible to convince people that it is literally true, but at the time the name of the county seat was Jerusalem. Now it has been renamed Cortland, partly to cover up the association with the rebellion, and to capture this Jerusalem, this literal New Jerusalem, and await God's plan for what would next unfold. Whether another military campaign, an establishment of a worldly government, or, as Nat seemed increasingly to have grown to hope and to fear, Christ's return and the Armageddon promised in Revelation that would destroy the world and in the process create a new Jerusalem where men and women, in his view, lived alongside God, the goal of his longing and of his fear. Along the way, one enslaved woman joined them. Other enslaved women cheered them on and cooked for them. But they also found that quite a few enslaved people refused to join or ran away, and a number of women who also alerted enslavers, and a couple of black men who hid them. Along the way, they killed approximately 55 white people with guns, axes, and fence posts, some in battles, some in their beds, skipping some houses of relatively poorer white people. They killed children, even infants, and left one baby's body in a fireplace. And they went to war not against one or two cruel people, but against a cruel system and the people who upheld it. And Nat went out of his way after, and I'll talk about how we have what purports to be his words, went out of his way to deny that those first people who killed, the man and woman who controlled him while he was owned by their child, were cruel. In fact, he would later say that they were not. But it was enough to say that they sustained slavery and profited from it. This was one of the 2 largest slave rebellions in U.S. national history, post-colonial history, matched only by an 1811 rebellion near New Orleans, and exceeded, arguably, only by events we don't always classify as slave rebellions, but that marked the consciousness of the people, white and black, around Nat. The dozens and hundreds of enslaved people from the region who fled to British lines in the Revolution and then fought for the British and fled to the British in the War of 1812 and donned uniforms and fought against their enslavers. If we consider those also to be rebellions of enslaved people, then it also asks whether the largest slave rebellion in U.S. history would actually be the Civil War, where 200,000 black men, mostly formerly enslaved, fought in the U.S. Army and Navy. And the women and children supported them with supplies, information, logistics, and at times active participation. After fighting their way, Nat and his band, to within a few miles of Jerusalem over the long day of August 22, they encountered the first organized white militia unit from the county near a place called Parker's Gate. And they drove them back into flight as Nat outmaneuvered, by all accounts, the commander of the white militia in understanding when to send in reinforcements and how to organize a charge. But then a second later arriving white militia provided crucial reinforcements, broke up Nat's company, and sent many in flight. Nat at first sought to execute a difficult flanking maneuver, crossing a small bridge to come at Jerusalem from a different side. But he found that bridge was guarded. Word was out. And he encamped at a nearby plantation for the night, site of one of the largest slave quarters in the area, as he tried to grow from a successful, very local rural rebellion led by a man that people knew and recognized into a broader campaign of enslaved people, many of whom had no idea who he was, against the system of slavery. Early that night, they were very vulnerable, but so too was the white militia, and they retreated back to Jerusalem to protect against assault. And the next morning, as the militia hid in Jerusalem, the white militia, Nat and his band attacked a nearby plantation, but they were driven back under heavy fire, breaking up almost all his band, and sending Nat back to the area around his original home, the site where he launched the rebellion. Over the next days, people and rumors arrived from surrounding counties and then from Norfolk and Richmond, aiming to wreak revenge, to slaughter white people, to slaughter until they had killed their fears. For days, there was widespread killing, indiscriminate killing, in Southampton County, and some places much farther away as rumors spread of a broader plan to revolt. And then after a few days, the state militia commanders and local lawyers tried to reassert the authority of the law. And white elites quickly organized trials that condemned 18 men to be hanged, others to be sold out of state. But as these trials ground on, Nat, the leader, could not be found. He hid close to home for 2 months as rumors spread that he was in Ohio or Canada or Florida or the Great Dismal Swamp or everywhere people claimed to see him, in part because they didn't know what he looked like. But he claims that he spent the whole time within a mile or so of his former home. Finally, on October 30th, 1831, after 2 months, Nat surrendered to a white man in the woods near the pond where the rebellion began. And over the next 11 days, he spoke repeatedly, consistently about the rebellion, first to the white people in the neighborhood who captured him, to the lawyers in the county seat of Jerusalem, to passers-by who came to the jail and called out to him, and eventually to Thomas Gray, a white lawyer who wrote what he claimed were Nat's words, along with some commentary from Gray, and published them, and this is in your resources, as Nat's Confessions, the Confessions of Nat Turner, as told to Thomas Gray. This book sold staggering numbers of copies in its time, though it's not clear that Gray himself made money and Nat and his family made none. I'll talk a little bit about that later. And it continues to be read and puzzled over today. It is widely available both in the resources here at the great Documenting the American South site at UNC, University of North Carolina Libraries, and also at an interesting site of collection of resources that I think I've included the link to called the Nat Turner Project, that includes many different resources, primary sources you can look at. While some parts of this might be challenging for some student audiences, depending on age and topics, some selections are actually very accessible. His discussion of his childhood, his interesting back and forth on his motivations. He's clearly not a typical person of any type, enslaved or not, and a strong sense of his personality shines through. And what also shines through is Thomas Gray's sometimes disconcerting and confusing set of responses, which includes horror at Nat, but also a somewhat surprising sense of admiration that also creeps through as they talk over 3 days. In the aftermath, Virginia's legislature, for the last time, seriously considered a plan to end slavery gradually. There was a moment where, if Nat conceived of his actions as helping to end slavery, that literally seemed conceivably true as the governor called in a secret session of the legislature. Legislators proposed ending slavery. Other states north of them had ended slavery. No one knew at the time that day was done. But instead, Virginia and then other southern states chose not to end slavery, but to crack down on it. The things they blamed for the flaw, that they blamed for the revolt. Literacy. So they cracked down on trying to punish white people for teaching black people to read, since Nat himself was an exceptional reader. Black preachers. They established more and more difficulty for licensing black preachers to preach, requiring white people to oversee them, and encouraging white ministers to focus on aspects of the Bible that seem to preach obedience, rather than on those parts, and I'll talk some about those, that Nat focused on, that not only proclaim freedom, but also what he saw as the righteousness of holy war. Although there are many narratives written by enslaved people or their interlocutors, the Confessions are startling because they record not just Nat's actions, but his descriptions of a series of visions sent by what he called the Spirit. Visions that directed Nat to carry out his glorious and terrible task. Spirit spoke to Nat, revealing, he said, the knowledge of the elements, the operation of tides, and changes of seasons. The Spirit showed Nat white spirits and black spirits engaged in battle in the sky, as blood flowed in streams from them, and was revealed then in what he said were, quote, drops of blood on the corn. And also on leaves, hieroglyphic characters and numbers, and images of men captured on leaves in the wood. And then, after years, the Spirit revealed the true meaning of the constellation in the sky. He said they were not the constellations, but in his words, as recorded by Gray, the lights of the Savior's hands, stretched forth from east to west, even as they were extended on the cross on Calvary. And the Spirit told him, he said, that the time was fast approaching, when he should take up the yoke that Christ had laid down and fight against the serpent. We can never know for certain when Gray was accurately recording Nat's words and when he wasn't. But we know Gray did not wholly invent these stories, because many other people heard Nat speak of similar visions, both other white people after his capture and enslaved people in their interrogations, probably under torture, before they were put to death for cooperating. So I'm going to take a pause now, and I'm going to move into it comes up in one of the questions, but I don't think I can see all of the questions at once. So the question 7 on the justifying, I can come back to that in a minute once we talk more about his religious view. But I'm looking, I can take them, Mr. Williams, unless you want to do so.
Oh, good deal. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay.
What did the earlier?
I'll come back and do some more.
Okay.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Good deal. Thank you. So there was a question early on about just the challenge of oral histories versus written accounts. Since Nat's world was oral and spiritual, how do you bridge the gap between written records of the enslavers, the oppressors, and those who are documenting this, and the unwritten beliefs of the enslaved community and or oral histories? Just a question about that challenge in reconciling it.
Yeah, this is a great question. And I always say that as historians, we have to start from a position of humility, which is that the past is too complicated and vast for us to understand even with perfect records. And we never have perfect records. And especially when you're dealing with communities like this, who are banned from literacy, though some people do become, very literate, and that was known by everyone, white and black, as exceptionally literate because of the amount of time they saw and heard him read from the Bible. But it's exceptionally challenging in situations where the records are so unbalanced. We have this very odd, publication by Gray, in which there's every reason to be skeptical of Gray, and yet there are also ways in which it aligns with both what other black and white people said. And Gray seems to have knowledge from Nat that no one else had put together at the time. So he's clearly learning things from these interviews that other people haven't been able to reconstruct about the attacks. He's clearly getting more depth on Nat's visions, but a number of people, including white people, had heard him talk about his visions, which is odd in retrospect, that it was not only one person. His enslaver's brother had considered him dangerous. They considered him, for reasons we'll talk about, eccentric. And also, as we'll talk about, there were other people with visions in the area and in that world. So it didn't stand out as much as we could. So we do have layers of sources. We have actions, and to some degree we can layer those actions enough to ask what is going on. So for example, Vanessa Holden, a fine historian at the University of Kentucky, has written about how to understand the rebellion from the perspective of enslaved women and children. Well, there are very few direct sources, but we do have records of actions that allow us to read in. What does it mean when we get some women who actively participate? Some women attack their enslavers if they find them hiding. Other women who turn them in or cook for Nat and his band, but other women who very actively hide white people. And it shows this sort of plurality of views of people shaped by all kinds of different reasons. By legends that's repeated, that's hard to pin down. When Nat is captured, the mother of one of his leaders comes up and smacks him across the face and blames him for killing her son. All of these are, plausible human responses and give us guard against saying this group responded in this way. Instead, we understand that there are people who are very excited to join Nat's rebellion and other people who are not. There are people who treated the Confessions as fictional. For reasons I'll get into in a few minutes, Tony was skeptical and I am skeptical, and I think some of that has to deal with the grave difficulty scholars have in dealing with religious actors and belief. It's sort of simpler to make Nat a type of figure like a sort of liberal revolutionary of the revolution, or a figure who fits more neatly into other forms of rebellion, whether liberal revolution, black nationalist, or others. And I think that has created a sense that this can't be right. He doesn't fit these types. And yet there's enough oddness and things about his portrayal that Gray, who was an atheist, wouldn't have known enough to invent likely, and wouldn't have had reason to invent, and B, that overlap with things that white and black people are saying at the time, sometimes under duress, and that black people say in oral histories, that it's clear that everyone saw him from the beginning as a remarkable and unusual figure, both religiously and otherwise. So as historians, we try and overlay, listen, figure out. I'll talk some at the end about some of the oral history memories of him and the way they played into some of the contemporary artistic representations. But it's a great question, and it's a great one to pose to students, in part because there's no easy answer. They're always judgment calls.
Yes, very much so. One more question. It's about your use of the term collaborators. We realize that early accounts often describe the group as a mob or deluded followers. And how does shifting the term to collaborators, how does that change our understanding of the agency or just the narratives about the enslaved men who joined him? Just using the term collaborators. Yes.
Because there's been a lot of naming politics. Go ahead. Sorry.
No. You go right ahead, please.
Okay. Sorry, Mr. Williams. There's been a lot of politics over all of these names, right? You know, is it a rebellion? Is it an uprising? Is it a riot? Is it a mob? Just as in, you know, there's long-standing debates and a lot of historical intervention recently in trying to rename things like the Wilmington Massacre from the Wilmington quote-unquote race riot, which was a language used at the time, but was not used, is not used by scholars. And this is one of these moments. In using collaborators, I'm trying to focus on the active, engaged, intellectual participation of the 4 people who matter the most to him and who are included in his plans. As we get into the next part, one of the things I'll talk about is a different set of languages that we tried to use to talk about the group as they're on the march, which is to talk about them as a military company. And you'll see that that is the way that, in fact, the number of Black Virginians spoke of them at the time as General Nat. And to treat this as a serious military set of maneuvers and a military action, rather than to fall into reusing words that actually, many of which have their descent from crime, right? This was a military rebellion and an effort to create a certain type of revolution, and using language that helps show who's thinking about it, how they're thinking about their participation, and then what they're doing, I think helps to break a sort of vision of uprising versus the established militia. Instead, we have two military companies facing each other. And that kind of wording can also be something interesting that students can think about. All right, I'll step back and do a couple of longer riffs on individual aspects. I wanted to make sure we all started from a common place of what happened. And then we'll take some more questions and then I'll come back. First, we're going to want to talk about the place where he is. He lived his life in Southampton County, Virginia, which is that red in the lower right photo, not far from the Chesapeake. They're not part of the Chesapeake. It's in part of Southside Virginia, where the tidewater lands that flow into the Chesapeake give way to farmlands that have much smaller streams and that are farther distant from trading networks. So they're still below the falls line. They're below the line at which which you get major waterfalls as water heads from the mountains down to the bay. It was a frontier, and white Virginians had moved there from the coast as Virginia fought against and defeated some native tribes pressing them farther back. And as land back in the Chesapeake and along the James River and the Potomac got too expensive. And they forced enslaved people to move there with them, often moving before the state of Virginia allowed it, to break the land and work it. One of those families that was early movers there were the Turners. And over time, they claimed ownership of 3 people who matter in this story: Nat, his mother, and his grandmother. This was a place shaped by rebellions in which, as I've said, Black people took up arms to fight for freedom. In the Revolutionary War, Methodist and other evangelical Black preachers from that and surrounding counties led women and men for miles to the British lines. And the men took uniforms and fought for the British, including Moses Wilkinson, who had become a church and political leader first in there, then in those camps, then in New York and Canada and Sierra Leone. From slightly farther away, because of the geography of the War of 1812, enslaved families marched to British ships near the Chesapeake in the War of 1812, and men again fought for the British. And then there were rebellions around the region, or plotted rebellions of enslaved people, not far away, many of which also drew upon evangelical currents. One called Gabriel's Rebellion in Richmond in 1800, and another in 1822 organized by a free man of color, Denmark Vesey, and other smaller ones in and near Southampton. And these give us a sense of the ways that fighting, or planning to fight, was a part of the culture of the area, not just of that area, but dense within the area. People knew about the Vesey Rebellion. They knew about Gabriel's Rebellion in 1800, and they knew about this history of the Revolution and of the War of 1812. And in fact, one white person in the county said when they heard there was an uprising, they thought the British had come back, and the slaves were fighting with the British. So this memory hangs over people, white and black. And it's clearly part of the backstory of why people believe fighting can work, and also what it means that so many different people are turning not just to religion, but particular types of religion. Thanks to wonderful scholarship on some of those rebellions and on that, we know more than ever about many of those rebellions. And we have a much clearer sense of a story, thanks to other wonderful scholars, than we did a few decades ago. But still, it remains difficult to see three central aspects of Nat's story that frame Tony's vision of the book he wanted to write: his life as a Methodist, as a prophet, and as a man his followers called general. One section of the Confessions describes A, childhood in the Methodist faith. A second details Nat's extraordinary visions, and a third his command of a military company. Those latter two roles, prophet and general, emerge from the first: a black enslaved Methodist child studying the world around him, a world shaped at the same time by warfare, mass religious revival, and, for a time, individual manumission of enslaved people. From Nat's words in the Confessions and from local histories, we have a strong sense of the white Turners and of the enslaved people in the region's deep absorption of Methodism. Methodism at the time was relatively new, and it took fire in this period in places like Southampton County that were the backcountry. Back closer to the Tidewater and Chesapeake, the Anglican priests, Anglicanism, the parent of what we call Episcopalianism in the United States, the Church of England, exerted more control. But in these backcountry regions, Methodism grew dramatically as people moved away from old ties. And it moved so quickly it eluded any kind of central control or capacity to produce pastors. Methodism gets its name from the method. It's a method of near constant meetings. And that is quoted by Thomas Gray on and on in really interesting passages describing his immersion in the method. His mother and his grandmother teaching him about the Bible. His participation and absorption in prayer meetings, biracial meetings held first in the Turners' living room and then in a church they built that for a time it's called Turner's Meeting House and now exists as a different name, but as the subsequent, as the inheritor church of that Methodist church in the area. And in reading and rereading the Bible, a work he came to know very well, to quote from and to pattern his life after, and that brought him renown for his literacy and his memory, renown among both white and black people. The songs he sang repeated the messages of the scripture, and the sermons from the itinerant ministers who would pass through, maybe monthly, maybe less often. In this message, which was central to early Methodism, though may not be for all Methodists today, the biblical story was a war story. In some ways, this comes out of their grounding in what Christians call the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible. In some ways, in the fact that we're talking about a period shaped by a number of major wars: the 7 Years' War, the Revolutionary War, Then after Nat's birth in 1800, the War of 1812. So a world structured by war, some very close to home. In these sermons, faith was war against Satan. Real war fought on real ground. And Jesus would return first in armor to lead a great victory over Satan's legions, and the world would be born anew. Aspects of evangelicalism rooted in the relays between the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible and the book of Revelation, which was much more central to the Methodism of the period then than it is to many descendant strains of Methodism today. And in this context, so too did messages take hold about prophecy. Taking the claims of prophecy in the Bible literally, not just historically, but to contemporary times. Nat was called a prophet repeatedly in his lifetime by both black and white people. And any reckoning with them requires taking the claims seriously. In the weeks between the attacks and Nat's surrender, while they're looking for him, probably Thomas Gray, but an unnamed Southampton County attorney, wrote to a Richmond newspaper, Nat had acquired the character of a prophet in his immediate neighborhood based on his conversations with the Holy Spirit. This is published before anyone has found Nat. Already the story is widely known from both black and white neighbors. When Gray interviewed Nat in the Jerusalem cells shortly before Nat's trial, Gray, an atheist, interrupted Nat's tale of words and visions from the Spirit to ask, "What do you mean by the Spirit?" And he records that Nat answered, "The Spirit that spoke to the prophets in former days." Every interpreter, by the way, you are looking at what is believed to be his actual Bible, a Bible passed down from that time and gifted to the Smithsonian, where you can view it in Washington, D.C. Every interpreter of Nat's rebellion has wondered at those lines. What does it mean that he compared himself to prophets of former days, and that some of his neighbors thought he was a prophet? For local white Southerners, it proved he was disturbed. Gray called Nat a gloomy fanatic, revolving in the recesses of his dark, bewildered, and overwrought mind. But it was clear that other people, including some other white people who were horrified by Nat, understood prophecy not as eccentricity or derangement, but something more powerful and more disruptive. Tony came to believe that Nat saw himself as a prophet in a particular sense common to early 19th century prophets, but uncommon today, as a person typed after the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible prophets, not just simply as someone who said inspiring things. This is a much more sweeping claim than it sounds, because often inspiring leaders are compared to prophets. But in this world, what Tony realized was that they meant something well beyond just inspiring leader or person who sees a vision of a better world. They considered prophecy something much more concrete, a specific fact. A prophet literally heard the voice of God and acted upon it. This form of direct communication from God, not just from the Bible, was common enough that Puritans and early national evangelical leaders distinguished between what they called normal prophecy, believers' experience of a voice repeating biblical verses, which they considered common and not dangerous, that a voice from outside oneself would repeat the words of a verse, and what they considered dangerous prophecy, the communication of messages from God or the Spirit that contain new words or images not found in the Bible. Normal prophecy was just that, in their view, normal, commonplace for religious people. But a dangerous prophet heard God or the Spirit say something not in the Bible. Periods of religious revival have often been accompanied by prophets of this type, claiming immediate direct revelation of new truths. So frequently that many Christian theologians tied to establishment churches tried to close the book on open direct revelation altogether, to say it had ended, because it was too dangerous. Open direct revelation was too threatening for many established Christian sects to countenance, whether coming from white or black people. It undercut the power of the pastor, the church. They couldn't be evaluated by experts or traced to texts or practices. The church could not exert authority over a claim that seemed to come direct from the Spirit. But it was common in the Hebrew Bible, in parts of the Christian Testament, especially the book of Revelation. And it was common for people in moments of upheaval, both political and religious, to present themselves. And it was dangerous not just because it threatened the pastor and the church hierarchy, but because so often direct revelation became a threat of mass bloodshed. What Nat drew from was that the prophets of the Hebrew Bible frequently heard God or the Spirit say to go and slaughter unbelievers or enemies in what was called harem warfare, a holy warfare of extinction. Most famously in Joshua, where after the walls come tumbling down, they massacre everyone inside, including many of the animals, and Jew it as a way of expressing worship of God in that book and in others. And so too does Revelation tell a story of Christ returning to draw rivers of blood from the serpent, destroy the world, and inaugurate the kingdom of God. In 16th century Germany, Protestant visionary Thomas Müntzer raised a peasant army of 8,000 under the promise God would directly intervene in a battle and, quote, inaugurate the kingdom that shall stand forever, quoting Daniel. 10 years later, radical Anabaptists, under the influence of two other prophets, seized control of the city of Munster, executed or expelled the people who were not Anabaptists, communalized property, proclaimed the kingdom of David, and anointed this city as the, quote, New Jerusalem, expecting Christ to return in front of an avenging army. In the 1600s, in the English Civil War, many prophets, including women, claimed divine revelation, prompting worry among establishment Protestants that these prophets meant to turn civil war into a holy massacre. And Puritans carried this fear of holy massacres to the colonies that became the United States, warning followers not to look for any revelation out of the Word. When Anne Hutchinson confessed that the mouth of the Lord hath spoken to her, promising to deliver her seed from captivity and, quote, utterly destroy all the nations, Puritan judges banished her. Puritan leader John Winthrop used the word enthusiasm to denounce Hutchinson as a purveyor of a dangerous immediate revelation, and the word would play a role in shaping Nat's own religious education. Because in the early 19th century, as Methodism is spreading, they're frequently accused of what, quote, enthusiasm, of mass singing, large revivals, and also the method that they took to prepare themselves to receive direct experience of God. John Wesley, the guiding light of early Methodism, accepted that his followers had visions, and many Methodists went beyond Wesley to say they had direct revelations. This didn't come out of nowhere. It was part of the disruptions in the colonies in the late 1700s that created openings for prophets claiming direct revelation from God. Responding to the political transformations of the Revolution against Britain and the religious upheavals of the subsequent Second Great Awakening, Baptists, a much older but very small sect, Methodists, a new but at first simply a reform effort within Episcopalianism or Anglicanism, and then other sects grew dramatically, becoming in some ways the default American experience of religion, at least for 100 years, in a way utterly untrue in the 1700s. Many, and often biracial revival meetings, many white and black prophets claimed in this time to have received commands from God, some couched in the common evangelical language of warfare. And many of them were Methodists, denomination with a particularly strong fixation on the imagery of religious war. In this era, unaffiliated prophets like Joseph Smith and Robert Matthews, both influenced by Methodism, claimed to found entirely new branches of Christianity, while former Baptist William Miller became convinced he had discovered the precise date of Christ's second coming and thus of the apocalyptic warfare to follow. Miller becomes a leader in the creation of Seventh-day Adventism, Smith, of course, of Mormonism, the Church of Latter-day Saints, Robert Matthews of an influential but ultimately failed movement. The same Methodism that fired prophecy also inspired a reckoning and a retreat from slavery. So how does this work in a world in which slavery exists? At first, many Methodists, including other Turner family members, were moved by the religious experience of Methodism to free enslaved people. Quakers first and more so, but Methodists and Baptists for a time, especially those who converted. And Nat's mother and grandmother, who are of course shaped by the 1700s world in a way that their son, born in 1800 and grandson, was less so, seemed to have this in mind, because Nat says they worked and lobbied for his individual emancipation, not the end of slavery, but the idea that Nat should be free because he's particularly religiously inspired. They're speaking to something that was happening around them. As I said, there are free black Turners living around them who had been enslaved by their enslavers' uncles or cousins, but then freed as they became Methodists. But that world is changing. Over the 1780s, 1790s, Methodism and Baptism in the South both start to harden against emancipation and to embrace slavery. Exactly as they are moving into these backcountry areas where the society has fought to drive out Native people. In Southampton County, the families that held Turner, the Turners, the Francises, all embedded in very close Methodist networks, most around this one church, shifted from freeing people, like his enslavers' uncles, instead to buying more and more, as we see a turn from a belief that slavery might be A, unchristian, and B, on the edge of fading, to a sense of it as something that is powerful, that's growing, that'll be central to Southern society, and also that increasingly turns to religious justifications. So a real shift within Baptist, Methodist, and other evangelical cultures, though much less so among the Quakers over this time. So Nat, born in 1800, is precisely at the age where the older black people around him would have talked about slavery of converted devout people as a violation of Methodism. They had seen that. They're hearing that Christian critique of slavery, but they're also aging, that's also, and his compatriots are aging into a world where increasingly white Southern Methodists, and especially the Turners, are preaching now that slavery is consecrated by Bible and God. As black evangelicals saw the church's retreat from emancipation, some continued, like Nat, to try to convert people into the faith they had. But many began to ask whether slaveholders represented the new form of the biblical tyrants. Thus, connecting the prophetic religion of language of warfare to their present scenario, they asked, was God preparing to punish the slaveholders as he had punished Pharaoh and the Egyptians? Richard Allen, who would leave the Methodist Episcopal Church to found in Philadelphia the AME Church, and now still a very prominent church across the nation, warned slaveholders that God had destroyed Pharaoh and his princes. His collaborator, the Black Methodist Daniel Coker, wrote a dialogue in which a, quote, African minister called on black people to take your weapon to destroy this mighty Goliath. The weapon he favored was scripture. And in the 1820s, as Nat reached adulthood, a Methodist black man named David Walker, from South Carolina, but then living in Boston, wrote in his appeal that American slaveholders were the modern-day Egyptians, crueler than Pharaoh, with their hardened hearts. Quote, when God Almighty commences this battle on the continent of America for the oppression of his people, tyrants will wish they never were born, Walker wrote. This pamphlet had circulated in Virginia, maybe not to Southampton County, but to other parts of Virginia, exactly as Nat's rebellion is underway. And that likewise seems to have moved from a hope that conversion would free everyone from slavery, himself from being enslaved and the enslavers from their sin, to a vision that the enslavers would never let go and that it was time for holy war. Let me take a pause here, take a few questions, and then I'll turn to the last section, if that's okay, Mr. Williams.
Yes, that's perfectly fine. Thank you so very much. The question about violence from earlier from Amanda, would you like to take that now, or the question 7 that was on there? The question Amanda had was, how did he justify the violence and death with his belief in God? And actually, Dr. Downs, you responded to this here shortly, but I'll go ahead and read this question out. How did he justify the violence and death with his belief in God? The killing of an infant, does that make him just as bad as the enslaver? A sin is a sin. That question from earlier, justification.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So it's interesting because it's a piece that, readers recoil from, that people recoiled from at the time. White people for sure, but also other enslaved people. There's descriptions of an enslaved man vomiting and, kind of revulsion at the slaughter in one of the households. And also, as I mentioned, of enslaved people hiding individual white people. So it's a response that, certainly most readers wrestle with, that is painful to wrestle with. It's also very clear that it's deliberate and it's something that he has talked about to his close collaborators, who he will later call his captains once they're fighting, which is that his understanding of Joshua and Daniel, Judges, and a few other books is that, and of their relation to Revelation, is that holy war is both holy and war, and it is a war to destroy this fallen world. And that in essence it required the complete destruction of the people in their path. Now, he doesn't quite hold to that. There are times he says, let's pass those people. They never owned slaves. But it's also clear that even when a group breaks into, the group that's not with him still carries out this plan to kill everyone. So it's clear that it's something they thought and talked about. And with the infant, there's actually, in a part that's most difficult for people to read, they actually leave, remember that the infant had been there and they hadn't killed the infant, and then go back to kill it. So it's very self-conscious. But I think in his context, it's part of entering in, as historians do, and this is what I always try to convey to students, that we're trying to enter into a historical world and to understand them as actors. And that is shaped by a experience, slavery, that is so profound. And he's also shaped by a set of religious views and approaches that are so profound that even, I'm not sure that even very devout people today can quite relate to a world in which prophets seem to be everywhere, and not necessarily dangerous unless they cross these thresholds. So we have to then have the humility to try to understand him as a distinct person, both in his individual, subjectivity, but also in the time and place that we're not really situated. For that reason, I'm much more interested in the question of how did contemporaries understand the morality of this than in how do I, as a 21st century person, see the morality of this. To me, that becomes just about me. I'm interested in the scope of the time period. And certainly some people were extraordinarily critical, especially white people, but not only. There were other people who accepted this as part of a religious duty and saw it not as some kind of contradiction. And other people who could not approach that, some of the later abolitionists, couldn't accept that religious vision, but did accept that it was a righteous response to the crime of slavery, a crime that eventually Nat thinks shapes everyone, whether they're a so-called good master or a cruel one. And he names the good ones and the cruel ones, but it does not shape who he kills.
Thank you so much for that. I'll ask one more, in the interest of time, I'll ask one more question. You in the book, you point out that Turner was he drew heavily from the Old Testament, specifically annihilation models of Joshua. And we have this image of the physical Bible, which is actually pocket-sized, from what I understand. But does the physical Bible show any specific markings or wear in those more militant sections that confirm his focus on specific texts? I guess I would also supplement that with the fact that I believe significant parts of the Book of Revelation are missing from that version.
Yeah, it's hard to know, with the, custody of the Bible, which of those, got lost over time, right? Because as you can see, it's pretty beat up, as you would imagine, from a book from the early 1800s. So it's hard to know that, and we don't unfortunately have the kind of notations, in the book that would say, aha, or those kind of moments. They really are kind of led to not only the discussions, but also the kind of references that are deeply buried in the references he's making. There are a lot of parts of what are recorded as his words that are either quotes or near quotes from the Old Testament, some of which Gray seems totally unaware of, which is a reason why it's unlikely that he made it all up. So, he refers to being murmured against, which is a reference to Moses. There are these moments in which, aside from that, the Spirit who spoke in the old days, spoke to the prophets in the old days, have explicit mentions like that. There are these other things that clearly show him speaking from his memorization of large parts of the Bible. And he was known for his extraordinary reading and his extraordinary memory, even as a very young child.
Very, very good. Thank you for that.
He was also known, there are many people who are prophets in the time, but he's also known for something else, which is that unlike most of those people, he embraced the idea of being a literal warrior. In Cross Keys, some enslaved people called him a prophet, but some called him General Nat. These don't have to be separate identities. The prophetic books of the Hebrew Bible are full of warfare and generalship. And there seem to be times he's reading it as a guide to strategy for how to flank an opponent, etc. And the book of Revelation is both prophecy and war story. The prophets of old had described the need to launch wars against God's enemies and to march toward the holy city of Jerusalem in hopes God would intervene and found a new kingdom. They received military guidance, and generals looked to prophets for advice as they launched devastating campaigns of destruction to fulfill their role. It's not a coincidence that in the relatively small county of Southampton, the county seat was known at that time by the name of Jerusalem. And that Nat, as you can see on this map, that sort of aims to capture where they are at different times, sometimes in two groups, as they're working toward, but not all the way to Jerusalem. He hoped to get there to inaugurate the next step in the coming of God. And to get there, he acted out the role of a general, deploying strategy and tactics to force battles, but reserving his ultimate plan for a revelation from God that makes it hard sometimes for people to break down his choices in the last days before they're broken up, as he's waiting for the next revelation of what would happen when they reach Jerusalem. He thought this not only because he read the Bible and lived in a time of ferment, but because, as I said earlier, he said signs in the sky and heard voices that were portents of a great war. And all these things can convey to us a sense of Nat as a prophet and warrior who's certain. And yet I think one of the great discoveries that Tony made in his last year of life, reading at NHC through books of religious studies and history that he had never read before, was to realize something about almost all the prophets of the Old Testament, that they all expressed doubt. And this is missing from Nat's words as recorded by Thomas Gray. But Tony thought that you could read it into some of the gaps in time. Again and again, Nat says God was clear to him in 1822, and then in 1825, and then in 1828, and then again in early 1831. And he tells with such confidence what God is telling him to do can make it easy to forget that in all of those cases, Nat still doesn't act. Instead, he waited. And in this waiting, it's likely that he, like the biblical prophets he read about and memorized, asked God for more. Almost every significant Old Testament prophet, says after a vision, "Am I sure? Are you sure? Can you give me something more? What's going to happen next? A promise, an assurance. What's going to happen to me?" Tony read these gaps in time into trying to reconstruct Nat and prophets as human, as people who, hearing even what they believe is the words of God, want assurance. And that to be a prophet was not to feel certainty, but to feel doubt and act anyway. And thus he became not a blind fanatic, hearing voices and acting, but a man struggling against his own doubts, as he came to understand over years the extraordinary thing he thought asked of him, to kill and to risk death for himself and for his loved ones. And here we get to a part also that scholars have wrestled with. Who were his loved ones? He was 31 years old when he died. He is believed from other references, some from whites at the time, some from, including Thomas Gray, some from Black oral histories later, that one among a few different Black women was his wife. And there are some different descent lines that claim to be directly descended from him that tie to one of a couple of different women. And it's believed that he had a son whose name is preserved in slightly different ways in different parts of the tradition. And it's, if they are who scholars have identified, they were moved away from him in his mid to late 20s. We're making it not to Mississippi, but still 8 to 10 miles away, which is a big deal in a rural area where few people have horses, which makes it much more difficult for him to see them. It's also believed that they may have, and he possibly too, may have been caught up in a set of financial loans that were going to cause potential future breakups of the neighborhood. Here we're left really wrestling with the unlikely, almost certainly in some cases, but at some level also the unknowable. And who, if he sees himself as a war, who are the people fighting it, that he's fighting against? And here we get the shift in his vision over time from seeing white people first as religious teachers who might free him, then as people who disappoint him but whom he might convert. Even in the last years before his rebellion, he baptizes, the only person it's recorded he baptizes is a white overseer who's plagued with pox and other sort of skin anomalies. The only person that he baptizes, and other whites know about it. And to a person who comes to believe the ultimate message is that he's been sent to make war against not just an individual bad enslaver, but a whole system, a whole society. And there's various traditions among both Black and white traditions about his emotional attachment to different people, including the oddity of the fact that one of the family members he didn't attack is the one he surrenders to. And there's claims about an early childhood relationship, which are certainly very plausible, given they were living in a very small, compound, but totally unknowable. And that along with agonizing over the death of what could happen to his wife, who was tortured, and his child, was also the sense of what could happen to people who he might individually care about, even as he hated their system and their role in it. In treating him as a warrior and a general, then, we try and treat him, and this goes back to the naming question, not as a crime, but as an act of war. But it shifts, it seems small, but it shifts the way that we can think. If rebellions are crimes, we look for motives. Even when we're talking about crimes we're sympathetic to, we explain them. But in the end, the quest for motives around Nat and his band is, while producing all kinds of fiction and film and other things, kind of fruitless. It's obvious. They fought because they hated slavery. What we've looked away from in not treating it as a war are his strategies, his tactics, his timing to move from the why, which I think is probably less mysterious than we think, to the how, which turns out to be how does he convince people, what does he convince them of, and how do they actually fight? Once once the rebellion is broken up, there are widespread republication of sort of wild portrayals of this, some of which are preserved, and horrifying contemporary images, and then widespread terror and killing of Black people, both connected to and not. Since Nat's time, he's become a figure of wonder and mystery. Now I'm wrapping up. For the thousands who read Gray's book, for the figures in radicalism and abolitionism who embraced him, for Black soldiers in the Civil War who patterned themselves after him or sang about him, for white Southerners who treat him as a figure of horror, for the people of the area who skinned his body, turned his skeleton to medical experimentation, as the great scholar Dana Ramey Berry has shown, and desecrated him, to writers, William Styron, movie makers and artists. As people have tried to wonder and understand how to make sense of what he meant and who he was. In recent years, when Richmond established an Emancipation of Freedom monument, they named more than a dozen great Black Virginians to honor. Only one of them prompted any controversy, and that was Nat Turner. And in both that controversy and the fact that they chose to include him, we can see both the endurance of the confusion and emotion around him, and also the shift in his time. By contrast, 140 years earlier, when the then largest Black newspaper in the country polled people for who was the most admired Black figure, many people named Nat and they silently omitted him from their list because they thought presumably it was too dangerous. Now it's at least possible, but controversial, to get to this place. And before I do my final close, I want to show you these quilts, which I think are remarkable. There's many ways new artists have been trying to portray them. These are some of my favorite, the Baltimore artist Stephen Towns. They're for their beauty, but also how deep he goes into Nat's story, trying to portray him in these quilts as a leader, a warrior, a prophet, but also a human, not just a symbol, and a man, and to create images of his life only barely visible to us, including the image of himself as husband and wife, with husband and wife. Generation after generation for 2 centuries have tried to remake him again, to speak for our time, which is important. And yet, the task I took on from Tony was something else, to try to make him in some ways harder to recognize, more strange, more specific to his time period, and to understand the world he saw and to hint at the world he hoped to come. I'm going to close with that word, hope. It seems challenging, even painful, to find hope in a story like this of seeming hopelessness, where everyone involved is put to death. Nat lost hope in America and white Christians, at least in his neighborhood. And the hope he inspired in his neighbors for divine intervention was disappointed. And in their attacks, they did things that trouble even his admirers today, especially the killing of children. So it can seem like a story of pain. It is a story of pain. But it's also a story of how people confronted a world that seemed immovable, incapable of changing, and believed for mysterious reasons they could move it. They may not have been right in the short term, but they also weren't entirely wrong either. In acting, they forced others to act in ways that had reverberations to the present. Thus, I think one way of trying to preserve the memory of Nat and its complexity is in this question of how do we keep hope alive? A question that went through Tony's own work to understand how people of the past found hope in moments of no hope and found reasons for believing and living in moments when it's hard to understand how and the pain that they faced. And in the belief, and so your presence here to me is a sign of hope and the great work you do with your students. And I'm glad to hang out beyond our time to take more questions. Not in the hope of wave a magic wand and everything's fine, but in a belief in our ability of our curiosity to guide us worlds very different from our own and back into this world aware for the first time of its contours and determined to find ways to change it. So I thank you so much for your time. And as I said, I know we're out of time, but I'm glad to keep taking questions until Mr. Williams gets tired of me.
That's not going to happen, sir. We are enjoying our time with you this evening. Question, just in terms of just contemporary echoes, how does the story speak to modern conversations about resistance and justice? Do you see his prophetic voice echoed in today's social movements or contemporary movements? I broaden it out, just any 20th or 21st century movements in particular. That notion of the prophetic voice, that natural legacy of Nat Turner.
No, that's a great question and a complex question, because of course sometimes people will make use of history in ways that academic historians who are trying to be so careful don't. They're making a map that fits their world, and that's what people do. They remake the past to work for their present. But there's all kinds of ways in which I think you can see, not just artistically, like what's on the screen with these remarkable Stephen Towns quilts, but also political movements. You can see there are Nat Turner clubs in some places. There are people, especially in Virginia, who claim him as a forerunner of a spirit, not just of protest, but of active resistance. The willingness to take really strong, bold, active stands of resistance. You can see him held up at times as a sort of counterpoint to ideas of reformist or some more nonviolent traditions of response, to suggest the need for a kind of radical boldness. And you can see even in places like Richmond, Virginia, this effort finally to say, well, how do we commemorate and think about a person like this? What I find interesting is that many societies actually have monuments to slave rebels. That's not actually that unusual. It's unusual that the United States has none, right? You go through their sort of remarkable, and I could do a different talk on memorials, but remarkable monuments to enslaved rebels in different parts of the Caribbean and elsewhere. The United States has been a place that has been much more reluctant to engage with that story, even as there have been advances, not just the end of slavery or civil rights and voting rights, but others. It still remains a very tense topic in the United States, even though other things have been memorialized a lot. So I think people are really trying to figure out how to make use of them in a way that respects his history, but also serves this urgent need in the present. How to understand the relationship between Nat and the idea of a need for prophets today? There, I think people have complicated feelings. One of which is there's clearly a desire for a certain kind of, that I contrasted Nat to, a certain kind of soft prophecy, a claim of a better world that can be beautiful and inspiring, but is not what Nat was doing. The second thing I see people really wrestling with is his does seem to be a very top-down movement. And as people think about movements for resistance that have more collaborative nature, they wrestle with the question of, is it just inevitable that a movement led by a prophet is going to be more top-down because it's claiming a distinct authority? Sometimes people disobey Nat within his company, but it's not clear that he's ever actually seeking their input. So I think that's also an interesting thing you see in activist movements for a long time, but especially over the last 60 years, or maybe even especially over the last 15, of how to build a collaborative movement that gives space for that kind of prophetic inspiration, but doesn't center everything on one human person. So I think there's all kinds of interesting ways in which his legacy lives, both in film and in art, but also in the way people think about what it means to imagine a new world and to actively try to bring it into being.
Thank you so much. I'll conclude with one question. There are a few questions that we have about additional resources beyond the primary source materials. Any recommended resources, expositions, or primary source materials that may be, or archives available for teachers to follow up on?
So an extraordinary one is called the Nat Turner Project, And I believe it's one of the links I gave, but it goes into, if not, it's just natturnerproject.org. And it has all kinds of fascinating primary source resources. Some of these you'll want guidance with students on because there can be complex topics or come from very specific points of view. But along with having a sense of, overview of what happened, there are also a lot of documents, pamphlets from the time, maps from the time, letters from the time. They can see if they can read cursive, which is a thing that scares a lot of students away from 19th century U.S. history. Runaway slave ads from the area, and I'll talk about another resource there, as well as trial records, which are confusing to read because they're preserved in ways very different from ours. But the trial records themselves, you can look at scanned versions, you can look at efforts to reprint them, and so it has really an extraordinary number of of materials. And it was created by a professor and dean named Sarah Roth at Meredith College, quite near you all, who had created this as she worked on other projects, including a documentary for National Geographic and I believe with students. So it's really a fascinating and useful site. There are also some really interesting projects on runaway enslaved people. So there are sites that have collected ads that are, and in fact, I think you all have utilized these in some of your projects. But there's some really exciting efforts to create, runaway slave advertisements that you can use to try and follow different periods, follow famous people, etc. There's also a really interesting site, Professor Jude Giesberg, that at Villanova, that collects different types of ads by formerly enslaved people. This is called Last Seen, formerly enslaved people searching for family members after the war. And so you can see these really evocative and heartbreaking ads of people describing when they last saw family members during slavery, trying not just for years, but decades to reconnect. Then there's some general extraordinary places for resources. So documenting the American South, which is a part of the University of North Carolina digital presence connected to Wilson Library, as the single best and collection of both memoirs of formerly enslaved people, so you can put Nat's story up against other people, including very little known people, not just sort of famous people like Charles Ball or Frederick Douglass or Harriet Jacobs. As well as a lot of other documents about the 19th century South, including from the perspective of planters and others. So there's, and there are, so there's a lot that is available out there. Some of it requires some curation as students, encounter topics or portrayals that they might feel uncomfortable with, or language that they might feel uncomfortable with, which is common in some of these portrayals. If you want to look at folklore, an amazing way to do so is through the Federal Writers Project. It's often called the WPA, which is the oversight organization, slave narratives. And these are held in the Library of Congress in a collection called Born in Slavery. And these are thousands, 2,300 interviews with formerly enslaved people. These need to be used with care, especially with students, because in some places the interviewers were descendants of white plantation owners and are reproducing them in very racist ways. But in other ways, like in Florida, they had really trained folklorists, including Zora Neale Hurston, and you can really see a lot there. Some of these do talk about rumors of Nat Turner that spread, some at the time and some later. There's also wonderful books. Patrick Breen, David Almendinger have written fantastic books in the last 15 years, along with a number of others. And Chris Tomlins also has written really interesting study of the trial itself and of the production of the book itself. So there's a number of really, and then I mentioned Vanessa Holden, who wrote a really interesting and excellent study of enslaved people, women and children in the period around the Nat Revolt. So there's secondary sources, There's a great collection of primary sources at the Nat Turner Project, wider ranging collections of primary sources around, and it's really probably a matter of curating.
Good deal. Well, thank you so very much, Dr. Downs. And again, on behalf of education programs and the entire staff of the National Humanities Center, just know that you're very much appreciated. And we look forward to having you stop by again so we can continue our conversations.
Yeah, well, I would love that. I really appreciate all this time. And now I'm seeing all these other questions. I wish I got to go through them. There's some other great out there. But thank you all so much.
All right. Thank you all. Thank you all. And special shout out to Keisha and Dorcas, who are populating the audience chat with resources, URLs, and recommended readings. So everyone, we appreciate you all. Thank you for joining us. Again, continue to follow us, all the things that are happening at the nationalhumanities.org and or our various social media channels. Support the humanities education programs. The NHC education programs provide a bridge between the academic world and the working classroom. Your gift, no matter how modest, can open up a world of ideas for teachers and rekindle their enthusiasm for the subjects they teach by providing the knowledge and tools they and their students need to make a difference. So we will be back on Thursday, March 5th at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific. Joyful Learning, supporting all students in the inclusive classroom with Paula Kluth, owner and consultant, Inclusion Rules, LLC. We look forward to having you all back here. Continue to have a productive week and a restful and restorative weekend. As I mentioned earlier, it is always a joy to connect with you all. Take care and be well. We will see you all soon.